Nicholas was working undercover as a doorman in one of the hotels from his luxury chain, quietly observing how employees treated guests and one another. He wore an old uniform, kept his head low, and blended into the background. Then Linda arrived. The moment she saw him in the marble lobby, she curled her lip in disgust and told him he made her sick. Nicholas didn't argue. He lowered his gaze and stepped aside, hiding the sting behind steady, controlled breaths. But inside, he memorized everything: her voice, her face, her cruelty. Over the next few days, every time Linda crossed paths with Nicholas, a new insult slipped from her mouth-sharp, racist comments meant to wound and belittle. Nicholas never reacted. Not a word, not a flinch. But he remembered. And that memory would soon matter more than Linda could ever imagine. What she didn't know is that the man she thought was beneath her was the one person she should never have crossed. Something was coming, something she could never predict. But before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's uncover how this story truly began. Nicholas stood at the entrance of the Royal Sterling Hotel as if the building itself were breathing around him, high ceilings exhaling warm light, marble floors shimmering under the rotating doors, and a soft December breeze carrying the muted scent of pine from the holiday arrangements lining the lobby. He wore the baggy doorman uniform the staff used on slow days, the fabric loose at his shoulders, the collar slightly too tight, and the cap pulled low enough that its shadow erased the lines of authority naturally etched into his posture. He looked like any other doorman except for the quiet dignity beneath his stillness. Every morning for the past week, he had arrived before sunrise, watching as the staff prepared the hotel with the practiced choreography of people who rarely got thanked. He saw the small kindnesses, Maria brushing crumbs off a table before a guest noticed them, Jamal straightening a crooked doormat so no one would trip, the front desk clerk smoothing her blouse anxiously before the first rush. These people were his heartbeat, his responsibility, his reason for placing himself undercover among them. He wanted to see the world through their eyes, even if it meant swallowing his pride day after day, pretending to be invisible in a hotel he built from nothing. A roar of an engine broke the calm. A sleek white convertible swung sharply into the unloading zone, tires chirping as if protesting the abrupt stop. Heads turned. A woman in oversized sunglasses and a diamond-studded coat stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She didn't look at Nicholas, didn't even glance in his direction, as she tossed her car keys toward him with a careless flick of her wrist. The keys clattered against his chest before he caught them. "Park it!" she snapped, already brushing lint off her sleeve. "And don't get your grime on the steering wheel." Nicholas blinked, barely lifting his head. Her voice carried that familiar mix of entitlement and disdain, like she had spent her entire life talking down at people rather than to them. He recognized the tone. He had heard it before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the mouths of people who thought money gave them the right to wound others. "Valet is momentarily busy," he said softly, steadying his voice, "but I can assist you." She finally looked at him. Not at his face, just vaguely in the direction of it, as though it offended her that he occupied space at all. A scoff escaped her lips. "I don't want you touching my property," she said under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear. "You people always have sticky fingers." A sting bloomed beneath Nicholas's ribs, quick, deep, unwelcome. It wasn't the first insult he'd heard this week, nor would it be the last. But something about the way she said, "you people," felt like a slap delivered with a velvet glove. Polished cruelty, practiced prejudice. Still, he bowed his head slightly, controlling the tension threatening to reach his jaw. "I assure you, ma'am," he replied, "I am just doing my job." She leaned in, her perfume thick and cold like winter rain. "Your job," she said slowly, enunciating every syllable, "is to be invisible until I need something. You're an eyesore in a place like this. Get out of my face before I have you fired." She brushed past him deliberately, her shoulder knocking into his with enough force to jolt him a half-step sideways. Nicholas watched her walk toward the lobby doors, each step deliberate, each gesture designed to broadcast superiority. His jaw tightened, the faintest muscle twitching. For a moment, he felt the old heat rise, the instinct to push back, to reclaim dignity she had attempted to steal. But he breathed, once, twice. He wasn't here to react. He was here to understand. "Kindness is a choice, not a weakness," he whispered to himself, letting the words settle his pulse. He placed her keys on the valet podium and returned to standing by the entrance. Guests flowed in and out, families with luggage stacked like towers, business travelers glued to their phones, couples arguing quietly about dinner reservations. Nicholas greeted each one with the same warmth, a nod, a smile, a gentle welcome. Then he heard it, a shrill voice echoing through the polished lobby. "That man threatened me. I want to speak to the manager immediately." Nicholas turned. Linda stood at the front desk, pointing an accusatory finger straight at him. The young clerk behind the counter looked frightened and confused. "He looked at me in a threatening way," Linda continued dramatically. "This hotel has clearly lowered its standards. When did we start hiring people off the streets?" A few guests stared. Others pretended not to hear but couldn't hide discomfort. Nicholas kept his expression neutral, though inside something cracked, not a breaking, but the quiet, unmistakable sound of resolve hardening. He didn't move toward her. He didn't defend himself. He simply stood where he was, watching her tantrum with the calm patience of someone who had learned long ago that truth didn't need to be shouted. Because truth, eventually, reveals itself. And he would make sure this one did. Over the next 3 days, Nicholas endured Linda's presence the way one endures a persistent storm, never loud enough to destroy the building, but always loud enough to make everyone inside feel unsafe. She moved through the hotel like a gust of cold air that seeped under doors and chilled the bones of anyone unlucky enough to cross her path. The staff tried to avoid her, each person learning quickly that even breathing too loudly near her seemed to provoke offense. But Nicholas couldn't avoid her, not without breaking his cover, not without abandoning the very people whose burdens he had come to understand. She targeted him with a precision that felt almost personal, though he knew it was never really about him. It was about what she saw when she looked at him. Or rather, what she refused to see. "Open the door properly, boy," she snapped each morning, even when he already held it open for her with the same courtesy he extended to every guest. If he bowed his head, she complained he was mocking her. If he stood tall, she accused him of arrogance. If he simply existed within her line of sight, she called it provocation. More than once, a guest paused in confusion, unsure why her tone was filled with so much venom. Nicholas never corrected her. His silence was not submission, it was discipline. But inside him, something quiet and old stirred. A memory of watching his mother come home exhausted, hands raw from scrubbing floors, but still managing to smile at her son as if the world had not been unkind earlier that day. He remembered the way she once told him, people show their character most clearly when they think no one important is watching. And Linda, he thought, could not have made it more obvious. On the second afternoon, he found Maria in the break room. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting a pale glow onto the small, cramped space filled with lunch bags, cleaning supplies, and a worn-out table that had seen too many hurried meals. Maria sat in the corner, shoulders shaking, her hands covering her face. A damp towel lay on the floor beside her. Nicholas approached gently, his footsteps quiet. "Maria," he said softly, kneeling down beside her. "What happened?" She didn't answer immediately. She took a trembling breath, wiped her face with the sleeve of her uniform, and finally looked at him. Her eyes carried years of unspoken exhaustion. The kind that builds slowly, layer by layer until it becomes heavy enough to crush a person from the inside. She threw it at me, Maria whispered. The towel. She said I missed a spot on her mirror. Oh. I tried to apologize, but she called me useless. Nicholas felt something sharp twist inside his chest. Anger, yes, but also sorrow. Not just for Maria, but for every person who had endured this kind of humiliation without anyone noticing or caring. You don't deserve that, he said quietly. His voice held a firmness that surprised even him. You are not useless, and you are not alone. Maria looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. But what can we do? People like her, they always win. They always get away with everything. And people like us don't have a voice. Nicholas swallowed. The truth tasted heavy on his tongue, not because it was wrong, but because it had been true for too long. Management creates the culture, he said, his voice low but steady, and things will change. Maria didn't know what he meant, not yet, but something in his tone made her stop crying. She nodded slowly, as if accepting a promise she didn't fully understand but desperately needed to believe in. The third day arrived with a thin drizzle falling outside, the kind that polished the sidewalks and softened the light filtering through the lobby windows. The morning rush had just ended, leaving a temporary calm in the hotel. Nicholas stood near the revolving doors, greeting guests as they passed. He saw Linda approaching from across the lobby, wearing an expensive coat and balancing a large coffee cup in one hand. She walked with her usual sharp, irritated steps, never watching where she was going, always expecting the world to move out of her way. When she reached the center of the lobby, the heel of her shoe clicked against the slick marble, and her coffee tilted. A dark stream spilled down the front of her coat and splashed onto the floor. Nicholas moved immediately, grabbing a stack of napkins from the reception counter and crouching beside the spreading puddle. Let me help you clean that. Before he could finish, her foot lashed out. Her heel struck his hand, knocking it aside. Don't touch me, she shrieked, her voice slicing through the air like broken glass. Look at this mess you caused by distracting me. Guests stopped mid-step. A bellman froze with luggage still balanced in his arms. Maria, dusting a table nearby, flinched at the sound of Linda's voice. I didn't, Nicholas began, but Linda was already raising her voice. This hotel has gone to the dogs, she cried, projecting her outrage to the entire lobby, hiring low-class criminals and pretending they're employees. It's disgraceful. Nicholas stood slowly. She was inches from him now, her face twisted, her fury sharp enough to wound anyone who dared breathe in her direction. I'm going to make sure, she said, staring straight into his eyes with poisonous determination, that you never work in this city again. The lobby went silent. For a moment, even the air seemed to pause. Nicholas didn't speak. He simply looked back at her. Not with fear, not with anger, but with a profound, quiet clarity. He memorized the particular shape of her arrogance, the way her voice trembled not with fear, but with entitlement. Then he glanced down at the coffee-stained floor, the mess she blamed him for, and then back at her. There was nothing left to say. As Linda stormed out of the lobby and toward her car, Nicholas stepped outside just far enough to watch her go. Rain dotted the pavement, reflecting fragments of city lights across the windshield of her luxury vehicle. He watched her slam the door, rev the engine, and peel away. Then slowly, he reached into the inner pocket of his doorman jacket. From deep inside the fabric, where a doorman would never keep such a thing, he pulled out a sleek, polished smartphone. His reflection stared back at him on the black screen. Not the doorman, not the disguise, just himself. He dialed a number. His assistant answered immediately. Yes, sir? Nicholas's voice was calm, almost gentle, but sharpened by purpose. I want a full background check on a Linda Vanderwall, he said, immediately. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his eyes lingering on the direction she had gone. He wasn't intimidated, he was calculating, and the storm she had created was about to shift because this time, she had targeted the wrong man. 2 months passed, though to Nicholas, it felt like an entire lifetime separating him from the days he had worn that stiff uniform and swallowed the bitter taste of someone else's cruelty. The world looked different from the top floor of his high-rise headquarters, glass stretching across the skyline, sunlight pouring into his office like a quiet blessing, and the hum of power surrounding him in every measured breath. He no longer wore the heavy boots or the oversized jacket that made him blend into the background. Now he was back in the skin that fit him, a perfectly tailored Italian suit that framed his shoulders with precision, cufflinks that glinted whenever he moved, and the easy, composed confidence that came from knowing he had built every inch of this empire with his own hands. His jaw was clean-shaven, his posture centered, his presence commanding. Nothing about him resembled the man Linda believed she had intimidated. He sat at the head of the long glass conference table, reviewing documents with calm focus, when his assistant stepped into the room. She always knocked softly before entering, as if aware that abruptness felt wrong in the quiet sanctity of this space. "Sir," she said gently, "your next meeting is here." A representative from Vanderwall Events. Nicholas did not react outwardly, but a single moment flickered inside him like a match being struck. 2 months of silence had not dulled his memory of Linda Vanderwall, her voice, her disdain, the way she had reduced good people to trembling versions of themselves. He had gathered enough information to paint a full portrait of her business dealings, her public behavior, her pattern of manipulation. And now she was stepping into his territory. "Send them in," he said calmly, though a deeper current pulled beneath his voice. His assistant nodded and slipped out. A few seconds later, he heard the distinct rhythm of heels clicking down the hall sharp. Confident, perfectly measured, as if announcing their arrival before the person even appeared. Linda entered the boardroom with the air of someone who believed doors should open for her automatically. She wore a crisp white blazer, a fitted skirt, and perfectly styled hair that framed her face in soft waves. A polished portfolio was tucked under her arm, and she carried herself with effortless self-assurance, chin lifted just slightly too high. She walked halfway into the room before looking toward the head of the table. The moment her eyes found Nicholas, she didn't flinch. No recognition, no hesitation. Just a widening smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. King?" she said brightly, extending her hand as though greeting royalty. "It is such an honor. I've heard wonderful things about your leadership. Truly, Horizon Luxury Group represents the gold standard in hospitality. I'm thrilled at the opportunity to collaborate and elevate your brand even further." Nicholas regarded her hand for a brief moment before shaking it. His eyes remained steady, unreadable. There was no anger, no triumph, only a quiet patience that felt heavier than steel. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "have a seat." She sat, crossing one leg over the other, elegantly, her portfolio poised on her lap. Her confidence radiated in waves, carefully curated, carefully aimed. Nicholas leaned back slightly, fingertips resting lightly against the table. To her, he must have looked like a man carved from control, someone whose professionalism bordered on coolness, someone impossible to rattle. She had no idea she'd ever spoken to him before, no idea how her own words once scraped against his dignity, and no idea that today she was being seen more clearly than she had ever been in her life. "You mentioned you value excellence," she said, flipping open the portfolio with performative grace. "My company specializes in elite events, galas, charity auctions, corporate conferences. We only work with high-caliber clients, people who appreciate sophistication." "Sophistication," Nicholas repeated softly, as though tasting the word. "And you believe your work reflects that standard?" Absolutely. She smiled, overly poised. My reputation speaks for itself. He studied her for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. Excellence is important, Linda, but I prioritize something above that. Oh? Her eyes brightened in anticipation. Character, he said. The word struck the air gently, but with enough weight to make her posture shift almost imperceptibly. She recovered immediately, smoothing her expression. Of course, she said with a soft laugh, naturally. That's very important in this industry. Nicholas's gaze did not move away from her face. He was watching the way she spoke, the way she blinked, the way she breathed, as though he could read the entire history of her treatment of others in the tension of her jaw. Tell me, he said slowly, how do you handle pressure? She seemed relieved to hear a question she could answer with ease. Oh, I'm excellent under pressure, she replied with a practiced smile. I'm a people person, truly. I treat everyone with the utmost respect, from the CEOs to the humbler staff. She paused only half a second before saying the last words, but Nicholas caught the exact flicker in her eyes, the subtle downward tilt, the faint trace of dismissal. It was the same tone she'd used in the lobby when she said, "You people." You treat everyone respectfully, he repeated gently. Yes. She nodded, leaning forward slightly. Everyone knows that about me. Nicholas leaned in as well, but with an entirely different energy, still calm, but deeper, slower, heavier. His voice dropped just an octave, just enough to shift the temperature in the room. Is that so? Linda blinked, her smile faltering at the edges. Because I heard a story recently, Nicholas continued, his tone deceptively soft, about a guest at the Royal Sterling Hotel. A guest who abused a doorman. Publicly. Repeatedly. Cruelly. Her fingers tightened subtly around her portfolio. He watched the tension in her shoulders, the faint stiffening of her throat, the moment her performance nearly cracked. She forced a laugh, but it was thinner now, stretched tight like thread pulled too far. Well, she said, lifting her chin, you know how hotel gossip can be. People exaggerate. Staff gets sensitive. You can't believe everything you hear. Nicholas didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't look away. What, he asked quietly, would you do in that situation? And for the first time since she entered the room, Linda did not have an immediate answer. Linda froze for only a fraction of a second, but Nicholas caught it. The slight tightening around her eyes, the brief falter in her breath, the way her hand twitched as if her composure were a fragile curtain someone had yanked open. But she recovered quickly, almost impressively so. Her lips stretched into a polished smile, the kind refined through years of manipulating rooms she thought she controlled. I would be horrified, she said, her voice coated in sugar that didn't melt. I have zero tolerance for rudeness. The lie slid out with such grace that one might almost admire its confidence, if one didn't already know the truth. Nicholas held her gaze, unblinking, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her wonder how much he believed. Inside, though, he felt the heat of memory, the sting of her voice calling him boy, the contempt in her eyes, the way she'd laughed when she kicked his hand away from the spilled coffee. He remembered the wet towel hitting Maria's face, the sobs in the break room, the atmosphere of fear Linda had trailed behind her like toxic perfume. And now here she sat, legs crossed neatly, posture proud, selling herself as a beacon of virtue. He nodded slowly, emotion so deliberate, so measured that it made Linda straighten up even more. Good, he said softly. Because we are looking for a partner who understands the soul of our company. Her smile brightened. She had no idea he was watching her with the same cold precision he once used when evaluating acquisitions worth billions. She mistook his calm for interest, his neutrality for respect. She leaned forward slightly, eager to fill the space he left open. If there's one thing I excel at, she continued, it's elevating an environment. I've managed some of the most influential gatherings in the state. My team is unmatched. You won't regret choosing me. Nicholas let her talk. Sometimes, silence was the sharpest instrument. When she finally paused, he folded his hands, fingers interlaced, a gesture that projected contemplation rather than judgmental, though judgment simmered beneath it. I'll give you a chance to prove that, he said. A trial run. Her eyebrows lifted, hope flickered in her eyes like a greedy flame. A trial run? Yes. Nicholas leaned back, the chair whispering beneath him. I need you to organize a charity gala at the Royal Sterling this weekend. A high-profile event, significant donors, media presence, minimal margin for error. If you can execute it well and show me you can work respectfully with my team, the contract is yours. Linda's composure shattered into exhilaration. Her breath caught audibly, a sound like triumph barely contained. I won't let you down, she said, almost breathless. She reached out her hand across the glossy table, palm smooth, confident, waiting for him to meet it. Nicholas hesitated, not enough for her to notice, but long enough for himself. Long enough to remember the sting of humiliation she had inflicted on people who worked with dignity every day. Long enough to remember how she had laughed, not just at him, but at anyone she thought beneath her. Then he extended his hand and took hers. His grip was firm, controlled, dominant, without aggression. Her smile flickered, uncertain for just a moment, like she sensed the shift in the air but couldn't place its source. One condition, Nicholas said, still holding her hand before slowly releasing it. She tilted her head. Of course, anything. You will report directly to my head of operations for the event. He can be particular. He watched her closely. There it was, the subtle tightening around her mouth. She hated answering to anyone she believed inferior. But she didn't dare oppose him. Not now. Not when she thought she was inches from a fortune. That's perfectly fine, she said lightly. As long as everything runs smoothly, I'm flexible. Good, Nicholas replied. Though inside he felt the heavy, steady thrum of justice beginning to take shape. A justice she had unknowingly walked straight into. Linda gathered her portfolio, already seeing herself victorious. Already imagining the photographs, the praise, the checks, the way she would boast to her friends about how she had the CEO of Horizon Luxury Group eating out of her hand. She strutted toward the door with the same confidence she had used 2 months earlier when stepping into the hotel lobby where she had belittled, insulted, and dismissed the very man now watching her leave. Except this time, she didn't bother to look down on anyone. She didn't even look back. As soon as the door closed behind her, her voice drifted faintly through the hallway. She had already pulled out her phone. I've got him wrapped around my finger, she whispered excitedly to whoever was on the other end. He's just another suit. I'll be rich by Monday. Nicholas stared at the closed door for a long moment. Then he pressed the button on his intercom. Get the security footage from 2 months ago ready, he said, his tone cool and composed. And tell the staff at the Royal Sterling to prepare for a show. There was no anger in his voice now, only purpose, only the quiet determination of a man who had seen cruelty up close and refused to let it flourish. The room felt still, deeply, profoundly still, as if everything was holding its breath in anticipation of what was coming. Nicholas leaned back, exhaling softly. For the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. Not because retribution was near, but because truth was. And truth always had a way of healing, even when it arrived wrapped in consequences. The night of the gala unfolded like a painting touched by gold. Warm light spilled from crystal chandeliers, scattering across the ballroom's polished marble floors. Musicians tuned their strings with the softness of a breath, their melodies blending into a low, anticipatory hum. Everything shimmered, the silver accents, the flowing gowns, the soft murmur of expectation. Guests drifted through the room like constellations moving in a slow, luxurious orbit. At the center of this choreographed elegance stood Linda, vibrating with stress so intense it leaked through every word she spoke. Her face was powdered, perfect. But her voice had the jagged sharpness of someone whose patience had worn thin hours earlier. Her heels clicked aggressively across the floor as she barked orders, snapping her fingers at servers who were already moving as fast as they could without drawing attention. "No, no, no, those flowers go there," she snapped, shoving a centerpiece slightly to the left, even though it had been placed precisely where the design plan indicated. A young waiter approached with a tray of champagne flutes, careful and quiet. He couldn't have been older than 22. His posture showed discipline, but also exhaustion. Linda seized the tray from his hands so suddenly the glasses rattled. "Move faster, you idiot!" she hissed, leaning close enough that he instinctively flinched. The waiter swallowed, nodding stiffly. His dignity wavered, trembling on the edge of disappearing. Linda didn't spare him a second glance. Up above, on the balcony that overlooked the entire ballroom, Nicholas stood in silence. His expression was calm, too calm, like a lake hiding the memory of storms beneath its surface. The tailored suit felt natural on him again, restoring his presence. But he hadn't forgotten what it felt like to wear the itchy uniform, the too big shoes, the fake beard. More importantly, he hadn't forgotten how it changed the way people looked at him, especially her. From his vantage point, Nicholas watched Linda reveal her true self, piece by piece, the facade crumbling under the pressure she pretended she could handle. He saw the way staff stiffened when she approached, the way their eyes ducked low, how their shoulders tensed like prey sensing a predator. He inhaled slowly. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was patient. He began to descend the staircase, each step measured, echoing through the high ceilings. Conversations paused, heads turned. The presence he carried now was undeniable, authority wrapped in quiet gravity. Linda spotted him from across the room and instantly her posture transformed. Her spine straightened. Her expression softened into an imitation of warmth. Even her voice shifted, becoming feathery and sweet as she rushed toward him. "Mr. King?" she exclaimed, as if greeting an old friend she cherished, rather than a man she believed she could manipulate. She lifted her arms slightly, as if guiding him to see the room the way she wanted him to. "Look at what I've created for you." Nicholas let his eyes sweep the ballroom, taking in the glittering displays, the elegant arrangements. It was beautiful. She hadn't failed in that sense. But beauty meant nothing when cruelty sat behind it like a rotting foundation. "It looks expensive," he said, his tone even but unmistakably dry. Linda blinked, not catching the deeper meaning. "Only the best for Horizon Luxury Group," she said, placing a hand over her chest in false sincerity. Nicholas turned to face her fully. "Tell me, Linda," he asked softly, "have you met the staff? Spoken to them? Thanked them?" She smiled, the expression strained. "They're adequate," she said dismissively. "Hardly worth focusing on tonight. Now let's talk about the contract signing. I have the paperwork ready. I think it's time we make this official." Nicholas let her excitement hang in the air for a second, then slowly shook his head. "Not yet." Her smile tightened. "Why not?" "Because," he said, his voice deepening, "we have a tradition here." "A tradition?" "Yes," Nicholas replied. "A speech to honor the unseen heroes." Before she could question further, he gently placed a hand on her elbow. His touch was polite, but firm enough to leave no room for resistance. He guided her toward the stage, step by reluctant step. The crowd turned toward them. The spotlight warmed their faces. Linda lifted her chin, immediately assuming the position of someone being publicly celebrated. She smoothed her dress, adjusted her hair. She wanted to be admired, needed it even. Nicholas stepped forward, taking the microphone. The room stilled. He looked at the audience with a calm that came from knowing he was about to pull truth into the light in a way no one could look away from. "Tonight," he began, his voice carrying with a solemn clarity, "is about truth." Linda stiffened beside him. The unease flickered across her face again. She masked it quickly, but Nicholas caught every micro-expression. "And sometimes," he continued, "the truth is ugly." A ripple passed through the crowd, confusion, curiosity. Nicholas turned his head just enough to signal the projection booth. The giant screen behind them flickered to life. Linda's smile faltered, not fully yet, but enough for the first cracks to appear. Up in the booth, the technician waited for Nicholas's confirmation. The room was holding itself in a breath. Nicholas exhaled once, slowly. "Roll the footage," he said. And the world beneath Linda's feet began to shift. The giant screen flared to life with a burst of white light, then faded into crystal-clear footage of a place that many in the room recognized immediately: the marble-lined lobby of the Royal Sterling. Soft murmurs rippled through the crowd. At first, people assumed this was the beginning of a tribute video, something inspirational or sentimental, the kind of montage most galas opened with. But the ambiance in the footage was wrong. Too quiet, too raw, too real. Then the audio came through. "You people always have sticky fingers." Linda's own voice exploded across the ballroom with such clarity that several guests flinched. It wasn't the polished tone she used in public. It was sharp, acidic, dripping with contempt. The kind of voice meant to intimidate, not communicate. Gasps broke out across the room like small bursts of thunder. The footage continued, showing Linda in the hotel lobby, her face twisted with irritation. Another line followed, louder, uglier, echoing through the speakers like a confession she never intended anyone to hear. "You're an eyesore!" The room fell into a stunned hush, so silent it felt heavy, like the air itself was choosing sides. Linda stood frozen beside Nicholas on stage. Her smile had collapsed completely, her expression dissolving into something pale and brittle. Her breath stuttered. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, fingers twitching in denial, panic welling beneath her skin. "No," she whispered, barely audible. But the screen had no mercy. The footage played on her kicking the coffee cup at the disguised doorman, the arrogance in her posture, the dismissive flick of her hand. It was her at her worst, magnified, enlarged, unavoidable. People in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at her with shock, others with judgment, a few with pity, though even pity felt fragile in a moment like this. Then the camera in the footage zoomed in on the doorman's face. A collective inhale swept through the room. The video paused. An effect shimmered across the frozen image glasses, dissolving. Hat fading away. Beard peeling off in a digital unraveling, until the face that remained on the screen was unmistakably Nicholas. A slow, devastating silence swallowed the room. Linda's body seemed to fold inward, her shoulders sagging as if gravity had suddenly doubled. She stared at the screen as though it had betrayed her, then turned her head toward Nicholas with the dread of someone realizing they had stepped directly into a trap they had laid for others. "That," she stammered, her voice cracking into the microphone, echoing through speakers she once used to command attention. "That was you?" The question left her mouth like a plea, fragile and desperate, as if hoping somehow that denial could still save her. As if hoping the truth in front of hundreds of witnesses could be undone, Nicholas turned to her slowly. There was no gloating in his eyes, no theatrical satisfaction, just something colder, steadier disappointment sharpened into resolve. His expression carried the weight of every insult she had thrown not only at him, but at people who didn't have the power to fight back. People who worked hard, who endured humiliation in silence because they needed the job more than they needed justice. His voice was calm, but the stillness in it was devastating. "I wanted to see how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you." The silence held the entire ballroom in its grip. Linda blinked rapidly. Her throat worked as she tried to swallow the rising panic. Her fingers curled into fists, then loosened again. Her breath shook. She looked around as if someone, anyone, might defend her. But every pair of eyes she met turned away. She had walked through life believing no one remembered the moments she bruised others. Tonight proved otherwise. Nicholas's voice deepened, resonant and unyielding. "And you failed." The words were simple, quiet, and somehow they struck harder than if he had shouted. Linda's chest rose sharply, as if the air had punched back at her. She reached out a hand toward Nicholas as if proximity could lessen the blow, as if touching him might somehow ground her. "But Ty, I didn't know it was you," she stammered, the desperation finally spilling through. "That's the point," Nicholas said, his gaze unwavering. "You didn't care who it was." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her polished facade had shattered completely, pieces of ego and arrogance falling around her in invisible shards she could not sweep back together. On the screen behind them, the frozen image of Nicholas disguised, vulnerable, and disrespected loomed above the crowd. It stood as undeniable proof that character wasn't measured in the moments when people watched, but in the ones they assumed no one ever would. And tonight, everyone watched. Even Linda, especially Linda. The silence that followed Nicholas's final words felt like it stretched across the entire ballroom, thick and suffocating. Linda stood under the harsh brightness of the spotlight, her breath fluttering, her posture wavering. Her eyes darted wildly from face to face in the audience, seeking an ally, someone to step forward and rescue her dignity. But every gaze she met slipped away. No one wanted to be pulled into the collapse unfolding on stage. And finally, the panic inside her erupted. She forced out a trembling laugh, too high, too brittle, cracking at the edges like shattered glass. This is a joke," she blurted, her voice straining for cheerfulness and failing miserably. She raised her arms as if inviting applause. "A skit! Nicholas and I planned this together to show, bad examples." Her laugh rang out again, uneven and desperate. It echoed across the room, bouncing back at her with the cruel clarity of truth. The crowd murmured, exchanging uncertain looks. But Nicholas didn't move, didn't smile, didn't offer even a hint that her lie might be true. He simply looked at her with steady, unblinking calm. "There is no joke, Linda," he said quietly, but the weight of his words carried through every speaker. "Racism isn't a skit." A few guests exhaled sharply. Others looked down, uncomfortable. Linda's face twitched, her mask slipping further, exposing not embarrassment this time, but raw, simmering anger. Her voice dropped its sugary edge and sharpened into something ugly. "Fine," she snapped, her tone cracking with frustration. "Fine. So I had a bad day. Who doesn't? But you," she pointed, a shaking finger at Nicholas, the gesture trembling between accusation and fear. "You deceived me. You tricked me. You trapped me. That's entrapment. I'll sue you." Her desperation clung to every syllable, frenzied and uneven. She looked around as if waiting for applause or at least a nod of sympathy. The room stayed painfully still. Nicholas didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted a hand and made a subtle gesture toward the side of the stage. From the shadows, Maria stepped forward. The housekeeper's movements were hesitant, her hands clasped together tightly as she walked. Her eyes shimmered with fear under the spotlight. Fear of Linda, fear of attention, fear of reliving the moment she had tried so hard to forget. But she stood beside Nicholas anyway, shoulders drawn inward, but spine straight. Her presence alone shifted the room. Linda's lips curled immediately. "Oh, for God's sake," she muttered loudly enough for the microphone to capture every contemptuous syllable. "Her? Really? Nicholas turned slightly, just enough to shield Maria with his presence. You didn't just have a bad day, he said, his voice low but carrying a quiet force. You threw a wet towel in her face because you were upset about your own reflection. You threatened her job. You tried to intimidate her into taking responsibility for your mistakes. Maria lowered her eyes, embarrassment flushing her cheeks. The memory clearly hurt her still. Linda scoffed, tossing her hair. She's a maid! Who cares? The words struck like a slap, sharp, cruel, stripped of any pretense she once clung to. Nicholas's expression tightened. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, controlled, a counterpoint to Linda's spiraling panic. I do, he said. The words boomed not in volume but in impact. Something electric rippled through the room. Because before I was a CEO, he continued, his voice thickening with emotion he rarely allowed to surface, my mother was a maid. And she cleaned up after people like you so I could go to school, so I could graduate, so I could build something better. For the first time that night, Linda froze, completely, not with guilt, but with shock. She'd crossed a line she didn't even know existed, and the ground beneath her seemed to drop. She began, but the word faltered. I didn't know. That's the point, Nicholas said. You never ask. You never look at the people around you long enough to see who they are. You only see what you think they're worth. Maria's eyes shimmered with tears she tried to contain. Nicholas didn't touch her, but the air between them felt safe, protective in a way the staff hadn't felt in months. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were watching, listening, awakening. Linda's chest heaved as she realized the shift, not subtle, not gradual, but total. The room had turned away from her, inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat. Their judgment wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, resolute, and unshakable. No, this is ridiculous, Linda muttered. Her voice trembled as she attempted to gather her things, her dignity, her collapsing world. She turned sharply to leave the stage. But two members of security stepped forward, moving with calm authority, blocking her path. Their expressions were professional, not aggressive, but the message was unmistakable. She was not walking out of this room on her own terms. Linda stumbled backward a step, her eyes flashing with outrage. You can't do that. I'm a guest. I'm a client. Her words fizzled as she realized she had lost control, not just of the narrative, but of herself. Her breathing became erratic. Her anger melted into fear, pooled with humiliation, twisted into disbelief. Around her, the ballroom lights glowed softly, reflecting off the elegant decor she had bragged about minutes earlier. Now it all felt like scenery in a play where she had suddenly become the villain, and the audience was no longer willing to suspend disbelief. Nicholas watched her unravel, but there was no malice in his expression, only clarity. A quiet knowing that cruelty had finally been held accountable. Linda looked at him one last time, her voice reduced to a trembling whisper, stripped of arrogance, stripped of charm. What are you going to do to me? Nicholas didn't answer yet. The silence that followed was deep enough to force her to face something she had spent her life avoiding: consequences. Nicholas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room was already frozen, held in a silence so sharp it felt like glass waiting to shatter. Linda's scream, raw, desperate, echoing with fear she was trying to pass off as anger still hung in the air like smoke. Let me leave, she shouted again, but it came out thinner this time, her breath shaking. I don't need your stupid contract. My family has money. She moved as if to step off the stage, but Nicholas didn't move aside. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his jacket with a calmness that made the audience tense even more. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't showy. It was the quiet confidence of a man who already knew exactly how this moment would unfold because he had prepared for it. Actually, Linda, he said almost gently, though the softness only made her flinch harder. That's the other thing. Her mouth froze halfway open. Something in his tone, steady, unflappable, the kind of tone someone uses before revealing something irreversible, sent a tremor through her hands. Nicholas pulled out a folded document, the paper crisp and heavy, the kind used for legal filings and estate transfers, not empty threats. The audience leaned in, trying to see. "During my background check," he continued, "I found something interesting." Linda blinked rapidly, her body stiffening with the recognition that whatever he was holding, it involved her. Personally. Deeply. And not in a way she could spin or charm her way out of. "What? What are you talking about?" she whispered, voice cracking despite her attempt to sound dismissive. Nicholas opened the document slowly, giving her time to watch her own panic bloom. "Your family money," he said, "is gone." A soft gasp rippled through the room. Linda shook her head instantly, violently, as if trying to physically shove the words out of her reality. "That's not true. No. My father's estate is bankrupt," Nicholas finishes quietly. "Filed 3 months ago. You've been living off credit and diminishing liquid assets since then." Her denial cracked mid-breath. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to understand that this wasn't an argument she could win with bravado. Her face drained of color, leaving her looking almost translucent under the chandeliers. "This contract," Nicholas added, lifting the document slightly, "was your only hope to stabilize your family's assets." She staggered a step backward, and her heel caught on the edge of the podium. She grabbed it with both hands, knuckles whitening as she clung to it like a lifeline. "No," she whispered. "No, that's private information. You can't. You had no right. It becomes public record," Nicholas replied, "when the bank sells the debt." Linda's breath caught in her throat. She looked at him with a trembling dread, the kind that comes when someone suddenly realizes the ground beneath them was never solid. Nicholas exhaled slowly, almost regretfully. "And guess who bought your debt this morning?" The room fell into a suffocating silence, everyone holding their breath as he reached into his jacket once more and pulled out a second document. This one he held up high enough for the front rows to see, the deed to her family estate. "I own your house," he said, not cruelly, not mockingly, just delivering the truth with devastating clarity. "I own your company's debt." Linda's face twisted, not with anger this time, but with disbelief, with fear, with the sudden collapse of the identity she had wrapped around herself her entire life. Her breath trembled out of her in shallow bursts. Nicholas took a step closer, his voice soft but mercilessly clear. "Technically," he said, "you work for me now." Linda's body folded as if the words had weight, dragging her downward. She clung even harder to the podium, her shoulders curling inward, the arrogance she wielded like armor cracking open to reveal something smaller, more fragile, painfully human. Her voice, when it came, wasn't a scream anymore. It wasn't even anger. It was a quiet, broken sound, one that carried the terror of someone realizing everything they built their identity on was gone. This can't be happening. But it was. And the audience knew it. And Nicholas knew it. And now finally Linda did too. Linda had gone from trembling to openly weeping, her shoulders shaking with quiet, hopeless sobs that echoed through the ballroom. Moments ago, she had stood tall, proud, wrapped in the armor of her own entitlement. Now she was a collapsed version of herself, her mascara streaking down her cheeks like ink washed from a page. "Please," she whispered at first, her voice barely reaching him. Then louder, cracking in the middle. "Please, Nicholas. Mr. King, I'm sorry. I'll do anything. Don't take my home." The words sounded foreign, coming from her, like she wasn't used to saying them, like her tongue didn't know how to shape apologies. And for a moment, the audience didn't know how to react. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched in morbid fascination, Maria, standing near the edge of the stage, shook her head slowly, her expression caught between sadness and vindication. Nicholas didn't immediately respond. He let the silence sit between them, not as a punishment, but as a space for reality to settle. Linda's breath hitched again, her fingers gripping the podium as though she feared the world might tilt out from under her if she let go. Finally, Nicholas turned his head, not to Linda, but to the crowd, then back to Maria. His eyes softened just slightly. In that way he had when he was trying to balance justice with compassion. "I believe in second chances," he said quietly, his voice steady but not harsh, "but they must be earned." Linda's sobs grew louder at those words. She pressed her hand against her mouth, as if trying to physically hold in the panic that was spilling out of her. Her entire body shook, and for the first time, she looked incredibly small in the massive ballroom she had tried so desperately to control. Nicholas took a breath. The kind of breath someone takes when they're about to do something difficult, not gratifying. His next words were measured, deliberate. "I won't evict you, Linda." Her head snapped up so fast it looked like it hurt her. Hope, fragile, desperate, trembling, flashed across her tear-stained face. "You can keep living," Nicholas continued, "in the guest house of your estate." The hope shattered. She froze, eyes widening in disbelief. "But the main house?" he said, his tone no longer gentle, just factual, resolute. "I'm turning it into a sanctuary for overworked service staff to take vacations." A murmur rippled through the audience, surprise. Some laughter of disbelief. Linda gasped as if he had physically struck her. Her lips parted uselessly, her voice lost somewhere between outrage and despair. "You can't," she whispered, but there was no force behind it, no conviction. It sounded like a question she already knew the answer to. Nicholas didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply stated the truth. "I can. And I already have." Linda covered her face with both hands, sobbing into her palms. Her entire body shook with each breath she fought for. "And to pay off your debt," Nicholas continued, his voice calm, "you won't be planning events anymore." She froze again, hands lowering slowly as if she needed to see him clearly to understand the severity of what he was saying. "The Royal Sterling," he said, glancing briefly at Maria, "is short-staffed." He stepped behind the podium and pulled out a folded uniform. Not elegant, not glamorous, not even flattering. A doorman uniform, the exact same model he had worn the night she humiliated him without knowing who he was. The sight of it hit her harder than any revelation before. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the podium again, breath trembling, tears spilling freely. "We need a new doorman," Nicholas said simply, "minimum wage." Linda stared at him, mouth open, face twisted in horror. "Tips," he added, "dependent on your attitude." The audience could barely process what they were witnessing. The power shift was complete, absolute, and yet delivered without cruelty. That imbalance made it even more devastating. Linda stared at the uniform as though it were radioactive, something that could burn her skin just by being near it. Her face crumpled, panic rising in her chest like a tide she couldn't outrun. "You can't be serious," she whispered, choking on the words. "Nicholas, please." He stepped closer, holding the uniform out to her with steady hands. Not triumphant, not mocking, just firm, in control. "Put it on," Nicholas said softly, "or leave and lose everything." The room fell into an almost sacred silence. Linda stared at the uniform, then at him. They had the people watching her, the same people she had always believed were beneath her, unworthy of eye contact, much less empathy. Now she was the one exposed. Stripped of protection, laid bare. Her throat tightened. Her lower lip trembled. She seemed to shrink inside her own body, crushed by the weight of her choices finally finding her. She reached out a shaking hand toward the uniform, then hesitated, pulling back, her breath fractured. I can't." But she also couldn't walk away. And everyone knew it. Because for the first time in her life, Linda wasn't just facing consequences. She was being asked to begin again. Linda stood frozen for a few agonizing seconds after Nicholas's final words, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as her body trembled with humiliation and dread. The uniform in her hands felt unbearably heavy, rough, unfamiliar fabric pressing against her palms like a verdict she couldn't escape. She looked around the ballroom as if hoping someone, anyone, would step in, soften the blow, declare the entire ordeal a mistake. But the faces staring back at her held no salvation, only judgment, moral clarity, and, in some cases, the quiet relief of witnesses who had long been on the receiving end of her cruelty. With a quivering inhale, she clutched the uniform to her chest and staggered off the stage. Her heels clacked unevenly on the polished floor, the echoing rhythm of someone whose dignity had fractured beyond recognition. As she descended the steps, a slow ripple of applause rose from the audience, not celebratory, not admiring, but painfully ironic. It was the kind of applause that stripped away the last illusion she had clung to. Even the sound felt like a mirror she didn't want to look into. Linda didn't turn back. She just walked, shoulders hunched, clutching the thin cotton uniform as though it were the last fragile thread connecting her to a life she no longer recognized. Nicholas let the applause fade before he turned back to face the room. The tension that had hovered thick and heavy moments before began to dissolve, replaced by a growing sense of warmth, relief, and something deeper respect. The audience watched him with an expression that mirrored one another, admiration for the strength it took not just to expose injustice, but to do it without losing his humanity. Maria stood beside him, hands trembling slightly. She wasn't used to being on a stage. She wasn't used to being seen. And she definitely wasn't used to being defended, much less honored this publicly. Nicholas placed an arm gently, protectively around her shoulders. She flinched out of instinct, not from fear of him, but from years of having learned that attention from people in power rarely meant anything good. But Nicholas's voice softened when he spoke, grounding her. "Tonight," he said, surveying the room, "we celebrate the true value of a person." His words were steady, calm, and warm, like a truth that had always existed, finally spoken aloud. "It isn't in their bank account," he continued, his hand giving Maria's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, "but in their heart." Maria swallowed hard, blinking back tears she didn't want to shed in front of so many people, but couldn't quite control. People in the crowd nodded, some slowly, thoughtfully, others with deep emotion, because they had lived versions of Maria's life. They understood what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Nicholas stepped forward, addressing the staff members scattered around the ballroom. Some wore uniforms, others were still working quietly along the edges of the room, unsure if they were even allowed to stop. To the entire hotel staff, he said, his voice now carrying across the ballroom with gentle authority, "Thank you. For your loyalty, for your work, for your humanity." He let that acknowledgement settle before continuing. "And tonight, you will all receive a company-wide bonus. A big one that reflects just how essential you are." The room erupted, not in cheers, but in a chorus of gasps, staggered breaths, hands covering mouths, eyes widening. For many, this wasn't just money. It was validation, recognition, a reminder that their lives mattered, that their work meant something. Maria stared up at him, stunned. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Nicholas looked at her with unmistakable warmth. "Then don't say anything. Just accept what you've always deserved. And one more thing," he said, turning to the audience again. "Maria will be our new head of guest relations." Maria brought both hands to her mouth as tears finally spilled over. She shook her head in disbelief, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. Employees who hadn't clapped during Linda's spectacle now applauded with genuine emotion, loud, proud, and long overdue. Maria wiped her cheeks, whispering, Thank you. Thank you so much." Nicholas didn't rush her. He simply stood beside her, offering the quiet strength of someone who understood that healing often begins in silence. Later that night, long after the music had faded and the last of the guests drifted away, Nicholas stepped out of the hotel into the cool night air. The world outside was calm, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged inside the ballroom. He inhaled deeply, slow, grounding, peaceful. As he approached the entrance, he saw a figure standing stiffly by the door. Linda. She wore the doorman uniform. It hung awkwardly on her frame, the cap slightly crooked, the fabric bunching at her shoulders. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes were red and swollen. Gone was the confident posture, the sharpness, the entitlement. She looked human, raw, uncertain, and painfully aware of her new reality. When she saw Nicholas walking toward her, she straightened, forcing her composure into place, though her hands shook. She pulled open the door with trembling fingers. "Good night, Mr. King," she whispered, head bowed so low he could barely hear her. Nicholas paused. He didn't smirk. He didn't savor the moment. He didn't deliver the cruelty she once so freely gave. Instead, he simply reached into his pocket and placed a generous tip in her hand. Her breath caught as she felt the money, confusion flickering in her swollen eyes. "Work hard, Linda," he said softly, but firmly. "Redemption is a long road, but it starts with opening the door for others." She looked up at him, shame and gratitude twisting together in her expression, forming something fragile, maybe even the beginning of humility. Nicholas gave her one last nod before stepping out into the night. He walked with a steady, grounded peace, the kind that only comes when justice aligns with compassion. And as the doors closed behind him, the night air seemed to embrace him, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who had fought for dignity and won. If you enjoyed this chapter and want to follow more powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.